Air accident investigators in the United States said today that restrictions had already been placed on the passenger plane after pilots on 3 previous flights reported warning lights. Something terrifying forced Donald Trump to shut down Anchorage International Airport in a way never seen before. A sudden emergency in the skies over Alaska sent panic straight to Washington, D.C., making it clear that this was no ordinary event. People at the airport were sipping coffee, completely unaware that within moments, chaos would erupt around them. What could have been so dangerous that it led to such a drastic decision? Tune in, because what happened next will make the President of the U.S. resign his position today. The flight that started like any other, it all began on a crisp, quiet morning at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. The air was fresh, the sun glinted off the freshly plowed runways, and everything seemed completely normal. At Gate 37, a Boeing 737 sat motionless, awaiting its routine pre-flight checks. The ground crew moved around it with the usual efficiency, inspecting the exterior, loading luggage, and double-checking the manifest. Nobody suspected that this particular aircraft was about to play a role in something far bigger than a simple commercial flight. Before we go any further, what happened next was far more terrifying than anyone at the airport could have expected, and this is just the beginning of a chain of events that will leave you stunned. The sky was as clear as it gets in Alaska, with only a few wisps of clouds floating across the endless blue expanse. For pilots, this was a dream-perfect flying conditions. No storms, no turbulence, just a smooth ride to their destination. But appearances can be deceiving. Some dangers don't announce themselves with lightning and howling winds. Some creep in unnoticed, until it's far too late to do anything about them. The passengers began boarding, a mix of business travelers, vacationing families, and weary commuters. Each person had their own reason for being on that flight, and none of them knew that their routine trip was about to become an event that aviation experts would study for years. The flight crew, seasoned professionals with thousands of hours in the air, went through their standard pre-flight procedures. Systems were checked, weather reports reviewed, and all signs pointed to a standard, uneventful flight. But sometimes, even the most experienced eyes miss the small details that spell disaster. As the engines roared to life, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The aircraft taxied smoothly to the runway, received clearance for takeoff, and accelerated down the tarmac, lifting gracefully into the sky. From the cockpit, the pilots had a breathtaking view of the snow-capped peaks below, unaware that something was already brewing in the unseen corners of their plane. The climb was smooth, 3,000 feet, then 5,000, then 10,000. The passengers settled into their seats, some dozing off, others flipping through in-flight magazines. And then, 23 minutes into the flight, something changed. At first, it was subtle, a faint vibration running through the right side of the aircraft. Nothing major, nothing immediately alarming. Passengers near the wing might have noticed a slight difference, a rhythmic pulse that didn't quite match the usual hum of the engines. The pilots saw two minor fluctuations in the right engine's readings, a temperature shift, a slight pressure change. Nothing that warranted an emergency, but just enough to put them on high alert. But the vibration didn't go away, it got stronger. High above the frozen landscape, something was happening to that aircraft. The right engine's internal temperature was climbing at an unusual rate, 2 degrees per minute. Not fast enough to trigger an immediate warning, but rapid enough to catch the attention of the flight crew. The shuddering grew more pronounced. This wasn't turbulence, this was something mechanical, something deep within the engine itself. In the cockpit, the pilots exchanged uneasy glances. The instruments told one story, but their instincts told another. And then, without warning, a loud, gut-wrenching sound ripped through the cabin. Passengers near the right wing saw at first a burst of smoke, then a brief flash of fire. The engine was failing, and it was failing fast. Within seconds, the smell of burning fuel filled the cabin. Flight attendants rushed down the aisles, trying to keep passengers calm, but panic was already setting in. The plane was still in the air, but for how much longer? Down below, air traffic control picked up on the distress signals. Anchorage International Airport scrambled into action, fire crews were mobilized, emergency teams were placed on high alert, and calls were made to the highest levels of government. That's when the White House got involved. The emergency teams were getting ready on the ground, but up in the sky, the real danger was just beginning, and what was coming next would be even worse. A voice on the radio that shouldn't exist. The news reached Trump's desk within minutes, a commercial airliner in distress over Alaska, with hundreds of lives on the line. That wasn't something he was going to ignore. Orders were given, the airport was to be shut down immediately. No departures. No arrivals. The runway had to be clear for whatever was about to happen next. Back in the sky, the pilots fought to control the failing aircraft, but that wasn't the only problem. Something else was happening, something nobody had anticipated. The instruments started giving conflicting readings, altitude fluctuations, fuel discrepancies, electrical malfunctions. It was as if the entire system was unraveling in real time. The pilots had trained for engine failures, but this was different. And then, a voice crackled through the radio, not from air traffic control, not from another aircraft. A voice that didn't belong. That's when the real panic began. Emergency landing procedures were initiated. The plane had to get back to Anchorage, and it had to get there fast. But as the pilots adjusted course, something bizarre happened. The instruments began behaving normally again. The erratic readings vanished. The vibrations stopped. The burning smell faded. It was as if the problem had never existed. But the pilots knew better. Whatever had happened on that flight wasn't normal. And by the time they touched down in Anchorage, emergency crews surrounded the aircraft. A new kind of fear had taken hold, not just fear of a mechanical failure, but fear of something bigger, something no one was ready to explain. The hum of the engines was steady, a sound passengers rarely noticed until something went wrong. And something was definitely going wrong. The right engine had started acting up, shifting power in a way that wasn't normal, though not extreme enough to set off alarms. Inside the cabin, drinks trembled in their cups, window shades rattled, and that familiar smooth ride started feeling just a bit off. The warning system was silent, as if the plane itself couldn't quite decide if this was a real emergency or just an inconvenience. Flight attendants exchanged glances, picking up on the small but unsettling changes. They'd seen turbulence before, but this wasn't turbulence. The usual drone of the aircraft had developed a rough, uneven quality, something that set their nerves on edge. They moved quietly through the aisles, checking seatbelts, pretending everything was fine. But behind their calm expressions, they knew something wasn't right. Meanwhile, deep in the plane's system, the onboard computers were logging strange, almost invisible shifts in the right engine, tiny fuel fluctuations, minor inconsistencies, just enough to suggest growing stress. The engine was fighting against forces it wasn't built to handle, but because nothing had outright failed yet, the full scale of the problem remained hidden. The plane was high above the mountains, which only made things worse. Normal procedure would be to descend if an engine showed signs of trouble, but here, dropping altitude could mean disaster. The pilots were already discussing backup plans, their minds running through every possible scenario. They needed to stay ahead of the situation, make decisions before the plane forced their hand. The right engine wasn't failing, at least not yet. But it was only a matter of time. Then came the sound, a deep metallic groan that sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. Something outside was shifting in ways it shouldn't. The right engine cowling, hundreds of pounds of protective metal, was tearing away. Passengers seated near the wing saw at first the outer casing peeled back, exposing the engine's spinning guts to open air. Sunlight bounced off metal that should never have been visible, casting eerie reflections across the fuselage. The smooth hum of flight turned into a violent shudder. The engine was shaking, not just vibrating, shaking. The air at this altitude was freezing, nearly -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Without its full casing, the engine was taking a beating. Air whipped through its exposed internals, disrupting every system designed to keep it running smoothly. Sensors lit up with wild readings. Airflow around the wings shifted unpredictably, creating turbulence that wasn't in any weather report. The plane was still in the air, still moving forward, but it was no longer in control. The pilots were doing everything they could to keep the plane steady, but things were getting worse fast. The engine fought against the sky. In the cockpit, chaos unfolded. Lights flashed. Alarms blared. The pilots struggled to keep the aircraft stable. The engine's power fluctuated violently, jumping between high thrust and near stall. Each change sent tremors through the plane's frame, rattling passengers in their seats. The flight crew was trained for stress, trained for quick decisions, but this wasn't just stress, this was a system spiraling out of control, and no training could fully prepare them for what was happening next. For the passengers, the shift was instant. Drinks flew from trays. Overhead bins rattled. A few gasps echoed through the cabin, followed by a heavy silence as everyone realized something was very, very wrong. The plane wasn't just bouncing, it was shaking, tilting, fighting against itself. The right engine, now partially stripped and struggling to maintain power, was throwing the aircraft off balance. The pilots worked frantically, adjusting controls, rerouting power, doing everything they could to counteract the engine's worsening condition. But the deeper issue was clear: the engine was tearing itself apart. Each rotation of its massive turbine blades sent more stress through the system, and with every second that passed, the risk of catastrophic failure increased. The cockpit filled with the relentless chime of warning indicators. Systems that had stayed silent before were now screaming for attention. The right engine's temperature spiked. Airflow readings were erratic. The plane's stability was at the mercy of an engine that wasn't cooperating. Passengers on the right side had a front row seat to the unfolding disaster. The exposed metal of the engine caught the light, making the damage impossible to ignore. Some gripped their armrests. Some shut their eyes, trying to will the situation away. But the worst part wasn't what they could see, it was what they could feel. The steady, smooth sensation of flight was gone, replaced by the undeniable awareness that the plane was struggling. At 36,000 feet, there was no room for mistakes. The pilots knew that. The flight attendants knew that. But the plane didn't care. It was following physics, reacting to forces outside human control. And in that moment, the fate of 178 souls hung on a machine that was no longer fully operational. Then it happened. A deep, gut-wrenching jolt shook the plane. The right engine gave a final violent convulsion and failed completely. The sudden loss of power threw the aircraft into an unbalanced tilt, forcing the pilots to react instantly to prevent an uncontrolled dive. The passengers barely had time to process. Before the oxygen masks dropped, screams cut through the cabin. The once calm flight had turned into a desperate fight to stay in the sky. The pilots pushed every emergency system into action, rerouting power, compensating for the sudden loss, but this wasn't just an engine failure, this was something worse, something that wasn't supposed to happen.